Okay. Well, welcome everybody to, I think this is, yes, it's ROI Group Meetup number 5. So it's a fairly young group, young at least in terms of how many sessions we've done, but some of us are older than others and some of us are younger than others, but welcome anyway. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. So you can see, so Ralph, can you see my screen okay? Can you just give me a thumbs up? Yeah, okay. Eva, you can see it okay? All right. So what we have today is another future shaping day for the ROI Group, but we have 3 very special guests that you're going to hear a lot more from in a few minutes. So what are we doing today? Let's just turn the slide and we'll see. I think, Toon, your group made this slide. It definitely wasn't a graphic that I could make. My graphics don't look as nice as this, but it's about creating Ottawa's future, and not just Ottawa's future, but also future for any city or town that's challenged as we are. You know, if you look at North America, and in fact, indeed, the whole world, the future is supposed to be really in the hands of cities that have populations of 10 million or more. And we don't have a single city in Canada that size. So there is definitely a challenge even for cities as large as Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, and certainly Ottawa as a second tier or maybe top of the 3rd tier. There are lots of challenges, but these challenges are for every city and town, I think, across North America. The 3 special guests that I mentioned, the first one we're going to hear from in a couple of minutes is Toon Dreessen. He's a graduate of Carleton University's Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism, where I taught for 14 years, and then my sentence was up and they let me go for good behavior. Toon is a member of the American Institute of Architects and was inducted into the College of Fellows in 2016, and he really focuses on sustainable infill development. So I'm really looking forward to listening to what Toon has to say about creating an official plan for the 21st century. We're also going to hear from Jonathan Westeinde. Jonathan, I've known him for a bunch of years, and his dad even longer. He is the founder of Windmill Developments, and you know, he was involved with Zibi, which is a very important project in the middle of the city of Ottawa. And he's especially interested in creating alternative financing vehicles to embed sustainability into projects. And I learned how innovative Jonathan is in terms of that kind of financing for green development. And I hope we hear a lot more about that from Jonathan today. And then here's my friend Ralph Shaw. He is the former president of the Ottawa Real Estate Board, is a broker of record for Century 21 Explorer Realty Inc. And you know, he's my colleague and friend, and in many ways a mentor to me. And I really appreciate all 3 of these people joining us today. I've been thinking a lot about why we created the ROI Group in the first place. It started off as a Facebook group, but wasn't really that exciting. And so what we tried to do was we tried to pivot to something that's a little bit more dynamic. So we do meet once a month online for 90 minutes, second Wednesday of each month, but no meetups in December. That's kind of Christmas time and parties and family time, and no meetups in August either, because that's holiday time. So 10 meetups a year might seem to be about right. And you know, people talk about developing for triple bottom lines, you know, economic bottom line, sustainability bottom line. You know, but I think there's probably, I came up with 8 bottom lines, but there's probably 20 for all I know. So my 8 bottom lines for any new development is, you know, to try and create more walkable mixed use communities, to build a great experience in our neighborhoods, to promote societal gain, tolerance, and inclusiveness. And then, you know, number 4 on my list here that you can see is really important because this is called the ROI Group, Return on Investment Group. And so to optimize returns, not just for developers, investors, and owners, but tenants and guests and people who use our buildings as well. So even there, you know, we could see a broader bottom line. Obviously, protection of the environment is paramount today. We'd like to be more self-sufficient or close to it in terms of food and energy production. We'd like to reduce waste. And then I added this one. This is Isabelle Bradbury, an architect in Gatineau, Quebec. It's her concept, which is fee hash for every home a job. It's a whole movement, and I certainly embrace that as well. If you have any questions for me or our presenters, can you put it in the chat box? You know, there's a Zoom chat box. And if you put it in there, I will see it and I'll read them out when we have time, or I'll come to you at some point where you can, you know, say what you want to say at that time. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples before I turn it over to Toon to do his presentation. We're going to hear from Toon first, and then Jonathan second, and then Ralph is going to, you know, wind this up. And we will be finished by 1:30. We always finish on time or very, very close to it. So in November of 2016, the city of Ottawa, I thought what was a very progressive thing, passed a coach house bylaw and official plan amendment. So they allowed people, as of right, in R1 zones to add a small coach house in their backyard. And I thought that was a really interesting animation, which helps obviously investors and owners, you know, people my age, you know, help them retire with some extra income if they put a coach house in their backyard. But it could help young people too to buy their first home and have some rental income as well. So I thought that was really innovative. But one thing they did in the bylaw and the official plan amendment in November of 2016 was they didn't allow you to have both a coach house and an in-home apartment. And I thought that was a mistake. And I've been thinking about coach houses for a long time. I just put this slide in for fun, because when I was at the University of California at Santa Cruz, I actually lived in a coach house with my friend you see here, not at 1011 Seabright Avenue, but in the little house in the back, 1011 and a half. So I have been thinking about coach houses for a long time, and I've been lobbying to get that changed. But when they made it so you could have one or the other, but not both, I thought that was a mistake. But here's the happy news. In June of this year, the Ontario government, and I'm not political, I don't belong to any political party, but in June of this year, the current government passed Bill 108, which now says, drum roll please, it now says that you can have both. So now you can have a coach house and you can have also an in-home apartment. So in an R1 zone, you could have a home, basement apartment, or a side yard apartment. And of course, you could also have a coach house in your backyard. So I think these are good animations. I call it animation, adding new revenue streams and more interest to our cities and towns. So I think we're on the right track.
Prof. Bruce, can you hear me, Prof. Bruce?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Can we? Sorry for interrupting you, but can we ask people to mute their things? There's somebody eating lunch, and we can hardly hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Well, who's ever eating lunch? Can I have some? So just mute yourself. So thank you about that. Thanks for the interruption, Rick. No problem. So what I was going to say is that thankfully this year we now have an animation that in every R1 zone you can have a single family home, an in-home apartment, and a coach house. And that's good, I think, for our cities and towns. More density, more intensity. So if there's a lot of background noise where you are, can you just mute yourselves, please? All right, so let's go to the next slide. Normally these ROI groups, meetups are on YouTube, so people can replay them, and they're unlisted. So they're only available to group members. But today is an exception because I want people to understand what we're trying to do here, which is we're trying to help create better official plans and master plans in cities across North America. So it will be made public. So just so you're aware, it will be on YouTube and it will be available to the public. Malcolm Gladwell is a Canadian living in New York. He's one of the great philosophers of the day, of today, of the 21st century. And he said that the single most important thing a city can do is provide a community where interesting, smart people want to live with their families. And I tend to agree with that. I think that is the objective of every city. And I put it a little bit differently. You may not agree with this. Not everybody agrees with me. I understand that. That's part of the give and take of these kinds of things. But I think the real purpose of a city's official plan or a master plan is to develop a platform on which creative people like people on this call, can produce an animated and sustainable urban agglomeration or urban center with as few constraints as possible. And some people don't agree with those last few words, as few constraints as possible. I understand that, but if you look at some of the best urban development in the world, it is not in outer suburbia where you've got 3,000 homes in a row without a store or a shop or or a doctor's office or anything, just 3,000 homes in a row. It's usually in places like the Byward Market, which is, center in the center part of Ottawa, which kind of grew organically, so without very many constraints. So that is my view, but as I said, not everybody will agree with that. And I put a couple more slides in here. So Toon, just get ready. I'm coming to you in a second. 40% of the buildings in Manhattan could not be built today, because of constraints from zoning bylaws. 40% of our buildings could not be built. So I think I'm right, but then again, maybe I'm not. And Business Week View put out a study that said in some areas, towns like Seattle, Vancouver, Portland, San Francisco, Toronto, housing costs are 50% higher because of zoning rules, 50% higher, and local economies are performing 10% below potential. That's big, but more recent studies put it at 36%. That is huge. And I'm just going to refer to this study from the Chicago Booth School of Business, where two economists said that in their opinion, from their study, it was a very good study, I read it, that if zoning rules had been as permeable in 2009 as they were 45 years earlier, that the US economy would be 36% bigger. And then I took that number and I said, what does 36% bigger mean? It means for a family of four, they would have an additional $86,000 US dollars a year in extra income forever if we had fewer constraints. So if you're looking at economic growth, constraints are obviously coming from zoning rules and bylaws and ordinances. At least that's my opinion. And so, Toon, I wanted to come to you. I have all your slides here ready to go. After that will be Jonathan, and after that will be Ralph. So I have all the slides in one place. And Toon, it's over to you now, but I will move the slides when you tell me to.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me here, and really excited to be here. You want to go ahead and click the next slide? So the City of Ottawa has proposed 5 big moves. They're listed here on the screen. If you get the Ottawa Citizen, you might have noticed Monday's editorial in which I talked in general about these 5 big issues. Today I'm going to kind of focus just on growth development, but very closely related to that is mobility, urban design, climate, energy, and public health, as well as economic development. And that's because these things are all tied together. And that's the thing, is that all of this is all connected. We can't just have a policy that deals with one thing like growth without considering how it's connected to everything else. And this is why I'm part of a national committee that's looking at developing this sort of holistic policy in the built environment, developing an architecture policy for Canada. Just as a little sidebar to that, if you look at the 20 happiest countries in the world, they almost all of them have a national policy on architecture. The Australia and New Zealand national policy on architecture has done a phenomenal job of addressing reconciliation and decolonization. And the countries that we model our social and economic policies on, like Northern and Western Europe, Ireland, Finland, Denmark, they all have very strong architecture policies that deal with not architecture in just saying buildings, but talking about the role of architecture in the physical environment in the built form and the social good for people.
Toon, if I could just chirp in for 1 second. When I was teaching young architects, I used to upbraid them a little bit about having architects having given up the design of cities to urban planners, which I think was a mistake. And so I completely agree with that view that you just expressed.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because urban planning is not a design skill. Exactly. It's planning. And, I have had regular fights with planning departments, planning staff who insist on altering the design of a building, and it's outside their scope. And that's not their purview. And that's not to say that architects are all good at urban design, but not all And some urban designers are good at planning and design of buildings. There's definitely population, cross-population of skill, but it's not the same thing. Oh, somehow the slide is altered. You've altered the slide, and there's now a big logo in the middle. Uh-oh. Okay, well, hopefully everyone will get that. So the new official plan put forward by the city is very ambitious. We need to ask ourselves how if we're prepared to walk the walk, because it's a fundamental shift in how we plan and build our city. We can aspire to excellence, but we need a very bold action to do so. We have to ask ourselves if our political leadership is up to the task of taking this bold action, or will we keep electing politicians who refuse to put action to words? Architecture is incredibly political. You know, we think about architects and politics, and architects tend to be fairly quiet and shy, retiring folks when it comes to politics. But everything that's affected by architecture is driven by political decisions. You want to click next? So we have municipal planning, and we have a vision for the future city that we envision, and it's codified in the city's current official plan, and it's evolving, and it's mandated by Provincial Planning Act and policy. But rather than being far-reaching and aspirational, this can and often does, it becomes becoming a tome of a document that is out of date, like all printed documents are, the moment it's printed. And it becomes subject to appeals and variances and changes, and it's the product of consensus. So in many respects, consensus can be a good thing, but it can also limit us. We have to wonder if achieving consensus is based on finding the path that satisfies everyone, and in doing so, doesn't satisfy anyone. A policy that meets the lowest is a policy that meets the lowest possible threshold of acceptance, the basis of consensus. And how is that aspirational? And how does that tie into what our vision might be? And we have many, many objectives within our cities, including green space objectives, objectives to having an accessible, cycling-friendly, and walkable place, one that's sustainable and has a place for growth. We talk about the fact that our 2018 strategic plan talks about world-class tourism and cultural centers and sports franchises. And we know that Ottawa is a technological hub, and we have enormous potential as a city to become the sustainable and exciting place we aspire to. But what is our vision? And I wonder if these 5 big moves are enough. Next.
Right on.
So these are the key policy directions within the growth development objective. You can see how they're connected to the idea of growth development. Of course, they connect to mobility as a whole, being a transit, walkable, and bikeable city. And it's not hard to imagine how a higher quality urban and community design approach is necessary if we're going to have more intensification with better designed urban spaces. The greater the density, the higher the quality of the urban environment, both the buildings and public spaces. And because the built environment and transportation can account for as much as 80% of all energy produced, and since we've declared a climate emergency, we know that how our city grows is essential to how we respond to the most important crisis facing our society today. And because buildings and the built environment affects 14% of the Ontario GDP, and 20% of tourism is driven specifically by those who come to Ontario to see arts and culture, visiting museums, historic sites, art galleries, and otherwise experience the architecture of a place. The way we grow is also closely tied to our economy. In other words, next. In other words, architecture matters.
Absolutely.
We know it matters. We see it all around us every day, but we choose to ignore it. We price it cheap. We set low targets for sustainability because it's politically expedient to set a low target, claim a win, and attend an opening gala or ribbon cutting. We could choose to make our LRT stations integrated with buildings, serving as anchors of the community. On the top left of the screen is the Calgary Central Library, designed by Snowhetta and Dialogue and located at a key nexus of the city, and it was designed through a competition. Below it, as reported by Alex Bozakovic in the Week and Globe and Mail, is Chicago's Independence Library and Apartments by John Ronan Architects, combining public libraries and social housing in 3 buildings, creating unique, socially responsible built form in a dignified, eye-catching form that engenders social equity. And all of this is possible when we focus on the role of the built environment in our city. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at growth development and what these policy directions mean.
Just before I turn the slide, Toon, I'm sure you're aware, at least initially, there was no plan to connect the LRT to the Ottawa International Airport because the airport didn't want to cannibalize their parking revenues.
Correct.
I mean, you know, who makes decisions like that?
You have to wonder who's making the decision and in whose interest the decision is being made. You know, the LRT, as it's connected to the train station, as it is today, has no escalator. If I was a tourist and I was being sustainable and I arrived at the Ottawa train station in January and had to decide to take the, you know, the LRT to town because I'd heard so much about it, how wonderful it is, no sarcasm there. And then I came out of the train station and had to walk across a parking lot, past driveways, broken curbs, sidewalks, in -40 weather to get to a station platform where I had to hunt for the elevator or take the stairs with my luggage downstairs to catch the LRT in a freezing cold, unheated, miserable shelter. I would be pretty unimpressed. This is a political choice. We chose that design, we chose that location. And those are choices that are being made, and who's making the choice.
Yeah, I don't really know, and there's still no plan. You know, I've got my Red Blacks hat on. You can see it here, my Red Blacks hat on. There's still no plan. At least I'm sure, I think, Toon, there's no plan to connect Lansdowne Park, which is in the center of Ottawa, where the Red Blacks play, and the Ottawa 67s play, and the Ottawa Fury play. And it's a major destination, and there's no plan to connect, the LRT.
Yeah, and so you're right. I mean, and look at what the original intent of Lansdowne was going to be an international design competition.
Yeah.
And that was funded and planned and canceled by city staff. So, you know, there's these challenges. So when we look at growth development, you know, we say that we want to achieve growth that's based on intensification, but we permit sprawl to continue today. And even under the proposed new plan, we will not halt expansion of the urban boundary, and will allow it to continue to grow, albeit slightly more slowly. But even though we have enough land as it is today in the city, let alone already enough land within the Greenbelt to accommodate the growth we envision in population. We also make infill development more expensive and overly time consuming, and it's out of reach of all but the very wealthy who can afford the millions of dollars in carrying costs and delays of our current planning model.
Right on.
And limiting the urban boundary is a political choice. I actually just saw a tweet today from a reporter at City Hall that they've agreed to fund increases to development costs and development charges and increases in fees so the city can hire more staff. The planning model's broken, and it's been broken for years, and the OAA had a report on this and its cost to the communities and society. Every month of delay adds $20,000 in cost per unit per month of delay to an average residential apartment building.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows,
housing affordability, and we're creating our own problems.
Yeah, and Toon, just so everybody knows, you know, I'm old enough, and I guess Ralph Shaw is a little younger than me, but he's old enough to remember when I did plan out a project, and I've done, you know, many, and it used to take me 11 months to do an official plan amendment, a zoning change, a subdivision plan, registration, you know, even a site plan. I could do it in 11 months, and I'm working with Claridge and a few other developers in Ottawa, and we're now, I think, in our 9th year on one project in Barrhaven. 9 years. So if your career is 40 years, you might only do 4 or 5 projects in a lifetime now. The planning process is very slow.
And it's a broken process, and you have to wonder who's in charge. We had a project in Centertown, and when it went to both the Urban Design Review Panel and then follow up with city staff discussions, we were told that Ottawa has no history of beautiful brick buildings, and this prime site on Bank Street should disappear and the building should fade into the background because this site doesn't deserve good architecture. So you really have to wonder who's running the ship here. We also talk about wanting to link affordable transit growth with affordable urban mobility, but we agree to buy a transit system that from the outset, we've agreed to spend $500 million more in interest alone than if we deliver the project through conventional procurement. And people wonder why I talk about procurement on Twitter so much. We increase the cost of our transit fares to be some of the most expensive in North America, but that disconnects us from our goals. And the award of public-private partnership contracts fail to meet the minimum technical scores, deliver lower value at higher cost over a longer timeline. This is a political choice as much as it is to raise transit fares. We talk about having affordable and supportive expansion when it's needed, but we fail to address the dichotomy between the cost of suburban and urban living. Simply put, it costs more to have suburban growth than urban growth. That too is a political choice. We declared a climate emergency not too long ago, and that was a political choice, and I applaud the politicians who did so and voted to support this. But it's empty words. If we want to connect growth management to greenhouse gas emissions and our response to climate change, we need to connect it to the political choices we make through policy decisions and leadership, to the planet we're leaving our kids, the debt we're leaving them, and our grandkids, and the city we aspire to. We want more flexibility in housing, but current policy discussions discourage larger units by incentivizing small apartments and disincentivizing family-sized units. We could choose to adopt the 20-20-20 model, as Montreal has done, where 20% of all units in the development are affordable, key to the average income, with a down payment advanced by the city and repaid when the unit is sold, with 20% conventional subsidized housing and 20% family-sized units at 3-bedroom or larger. This was a political choice with a Montreal bylaw introduced this past June. If they made that choice, we can make the same choice. Next.
Just before I change the slide, if you have any questions for Tone, put it in the chat box. If you put your cursor in the Zoom window, you'll see a chat box, and you can write any questions that you want. The only stuff so far in the chat box has been people complaining about folks not muting their mics, but that's all taken care of now. So put some questions in there for Tone. All right, Tone, over to you.
So we talk about context sensitivity in creating new housing, but our city and our planners approve developments that go against carefully wrought community design plans and over the objections of neighbors. And this isn't about NIMBYism, it's about building trust within our communities and having an open, honest, and trusted relationship between our planning department and communities. Approving these developments is a political choice, and you can see the challenge that comes in with this. When we get things like the Oblates land, where carefully wrought community plan, everybody agreed that 6 stories would be okay, and then everyone's really upset when it goes to 9 stories and gets approved. And the councillors who are approving this are not the ones who are affected by this because of the political choice of how the planning committee was stacked. You know, same thing happened on the Trinity lands at Bayview. You know, a carefully worked out community design plan for 30 stories was agreed to, and in 1 week it gets doubled to 65 stories. Wow. Alex Bozakovic, when he was here visiting the LRT last week, he came up specifically to see the LRT, and he included this tweet where he shows the Blair Station, where 50% of the land around the Blair Station can never, ever, ever get development on it because it's highway interchanges. And how would you choose to live there? So we talk about this kind of context, and we want to include more housing and city facilities and have a higher quality city project. But our procurement models reward firms who bid low, and we shun design competitions, and the few times we've agreed to host them, we cancel them. And we plan our transit systems so they have little or no buildable land around them. We talk about managing rural growth to manage rural character, but we build ever wider highways and send bigger roads to encourage sprawl. And we talk about complete communities, and of course one of the challenges is that the intimate village feel of a small rural community can only support the limited growth of that community. We can't expect to put a subdivision of 10,000 homes in a rural village and expect it to retain its character and provide all the jobs and industries of the city of 1 million or more people. So this is a dichotomy that I don't necessarily have the answers to. Next.
Before I go there, I have a question for you, Tone, from Pam Cripps.
Go ahead.
Okay. She's wondering if maybe is there room in the official plan or in a city generally for a community benefit agreement, which would say, okay, you want to build 60 stories instead of 30, you've got to provide more community benefits, because Pam, just so you know, Tone is involved with the Emily Murphy Nonprofit Housing Corporation. They provide a very affordable, supportive housing for single moms and single dads, as with rents for a 3-bedroom stacked town as low as $95 a month. So she's wondering if you could see a role for community benefit agreements that allow more density but provide more benefits to the community.
I think you definitely could. I think there's definitely ways to do that. And the challenge is that those benefits have to be real. I believe that the community benefit that was agreed to for the 65-story towers is something like $6 million, which is going to build about 20 units. Whereas I think it was under Section 37, I think it would have been 120 units or 10%. So there's a huge difference, and that community benefit has to be something that's done in the public interest. A really good example is the Seagram's Tower. That was a really innovative choice that was made, where the developer was given the opportunity to, I think it was for every square meter of public space, public plaza they built, they could have 10 square meters of additional floor plate. So that created an opportunity to create a really beautiful, carefully designed point tower with an enormous public plaza and landscape space that was a public benefit. So there's definitely ways to make that work, but they have to be creative. So if we go look at the slides now, we look east of the Blair station, which is now open. All 5 stage 2 LRT stations are located on the median of Highway 174, including the Orleans Boulevard station, which is pictured here. So where we build transit affects where we can locate housing. Do we want to build this kind of affordable housing only at stations and make that an issue of race and class by making the city's only significant affordable housing at highways where the higher noise levels, pollution, and lack of walkability are higher, forcing people to choose between affordable housing or their mental and physical health? We have to ask ourselves if we would want to live on highway off-ramp. Would you ride your bike to any of these stations? How walkable are they? Are they contributing to the food deserts where we don't have enough places for people to grocery shop within walkable distances? And what alternative do we offer? Instead, we have massive park and rides with multiple transfer points between systems and lack of integrated connections. And it isn't just to say, oh, well, that's some future phase of the LRT. That's a phase we've just bought for an untold billions of dollars. And it's also in the current phase and the stuff we've just finished. We're supposedly making with an eye towards adding to our so-called world-class gold medal cycling network. It's not connected. This is a tweet from Jay Huberman the other day, and he was trying to get from the LRT to the MUP, and you can see, you know, the blue line and the green dot and the gray arrows. He had to go through a nightmare path to try to make a connection. And this is on a system that's just opened. How do we aspire to excellence if we can't get the very basics right? Next. So we have to make integrated projects. When we choose to site our central library in an area of town where we won't see growth for decades, is that serving the people of today or tomorrow? And how does that have to be, and does that have to be mutually exclusive? Why don't we locate our library directly on transit instead of merely near it? Why do our political leaders get bent out of shape about thinking outside of the box? Do we want to build and hope that people will come, ignoring the needs of today? Or do we want to build for a site that accommodates everyone, including our children and our grandchildren? I'm going to just have a caveat here. I became a grandfather a month ago, and the thought of my grandchild not being able to take transit from, you know, east end of Ottawa, where we live, to the library and actually get to the library in one shot is kind of distressing. Like, this is a building that's going to be here for generations, and there's no connection. There's a connection, sure, it's a path, it's outside, it's cold, it's wet, it's miserable, but it's not connected. Why are we choosing to do that? We could choose better. We don't choose better. We choose poorly. Next. So projects have to be integrated. We have to ask how a vision for 84 vacant hectares in the heart of the capital aligns with a national vision for the city and at the same time reflects the needs of our own communities. Should the Breton Flats be a showcase for all that Canada is and could be, or should it be an integrated part of our own community? Or can it be both? And they aren't mutually exclusive arguments. There's no reason to imagine that we can't make a great place for people and showcase our city in the best possible light. We need to reform procurement. The hiring of architects and engineers favors those who bid low, not those who innovate and aspire to excellence with forward-thinking, creative, and innovative solutions. We need to abandon ill-informed contracts that unfairly punish architects and engineers who strive to make the city better. We need to abandon the belief that low-priced professional services are in the public interest and that design competitions are a waste of money, and instead see competitions as a way to engage communities, undertake social procurement, and generate ideas for the city we aspire to. We need to see that design adds value. Next.
Before I do that, can I chirp in one more time?
Yeah.
Douglas Cardinal, who's one of Canada's best known architects, and he did the Museum of History.
Yep.
You know, he told me that when he built that, he got into a big argument with Public Works Canada. For those of you who know the site, it's a beautiful museum in Gatineau, Quebec, and it overlooks the Ottawa River, and it's got curvaceous architecture back in the day when that was hard to design and build. And so Public Works Canada said, hey, it would be a lot cheaper if you just build a square box, a warehouse, and Doug didn't want to do that. So he went to see the first Prime Minister Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and he said, Prime Minister, I'm having an argument with Public Works. I need an extra $20 million to finish the design for this really innovative building. And if I do that, we'll probably get an extra $5 million a year from just simply having a more beautiful, more interesting building that will have a lot more admission income. And so Douglas was able to say to the Prime Minister of the day that the value that he was creating was worth the extra cost. And architecture, as Toon is saying, and much of what we do today, is all about what does it cost, what does it cost, what does it cost. Instead, we should be transitioning the argument, as Toon has said, and I said in my teaching, we should transition not to what something costs, but to what value it's creating. And certainly Douglas won that argument, and he got the extra 20 million that he needed.
Absolutely. So it's interesting to draw the contrast to the city of Edmonton. They're in the midst of building over $1 billion worth of community recreation centers, pools, libraries, and civic buildings. And they're doing this in the same population and the same tax base as Ottawa, slightly lower property taxes. They've just completed a series of design competitions for park facilities, including basic things like public washrooms and change rooms, with places for picnics and public gatherings that garner international attention for their design excellence. If you made a list of the very best Canadian architects practicing today, delivering the most stunning, high-performing public infrastructure, every single one of them is doing amazing work in Edmonton, and not a single one of those firms is doing work in Ottawa, our nation's capital. And you have to wonder why that is. In a recent public talk, city architect Carl Belanger commented that a local politician running for office in Edmonton assailed the recent building boom and said that the city was spending way too much money on buildings, and the public backlash was instantaneous and harsh. People rejected his political position and demanded that these are the sort of spaces they want. This is what they pay taxes for. They want the high quality spaces for people. So we have to ask ourselves in Ottawa, do we want to spend our budget on potholes, parking, and paving, or on places for people? Next. We need to focus on making places for people, in my humble opinion. We need to see that our prosperity is tied to the investment in the built environment, and if we want to achieve our potential, policy-based decision-making on the built environment is essential. Next. The status quo is simply not acceptable. We need vision, we need leadership, we need strong policy documents that are integrated with the vision we have for our city. I encourage you on social media to use the hashtag Rise for Architecture or follow Rise for Arch. It's actually Rise for Arch, my mistake, which is part of a national movement to connect the ideas of that we're seeing in our 5 bold moves of the City of Ottawa official plan, and that we can see translating to cities across the country, municipalities, provinces, everything that we do and everything that we build. Every building that we see today is part of our cultural heritage, and we need to build properly and build better places for people. Thanks very much.
Wow, great job, Toon. Matt Slobodian, can you unmute yourself? Because I know you wanted to make a comment about what's happening in Winnipeg.
Oh, yeah, I just made a comment in that post there, just regarding that, the LRT stations and kind of the proposed developments. We went through that pretty recently here, the last couple of years now, where our bus rapid transit systems, we don't have LRTs, don't see that in the foreseeable future, but basically, yeah, we're trying to connect some of our higher density urban areas to downtown Winnipeg. And so with that, they're providing these bus rapid transit stations where, people can jump on, and there's some excess land that they're, trying to toss around what they're doing. And so our city has allowed for high density uses in those areas. So, so they're trying to create multifamily developments as well as mixed use of, providing accessibility for those that don't necessarily have access to vehicles and ways to commute. So it seems like that's something similar to what's happening in Ottawa. So I just wanted to make the comment there.
I agree with you. I mean, I think that's definitely a possibility. I think that the challenge is that and I've addressed this in other talks and publications, is that we go from single family housing and then we put an LRT system and then we put a 30-story tower next to it. 30-story towers are slower to market, they're more expensive, they're less sustainable. The missing middle is really the key market that has to be tackled, and that's a really important piece. And there's definitely a place for taller towers. We have to think about the sustainability of them, but they have to be integrated. And this is part of the challenge with our LRT, is that where we're locating the stations, like, you know, could you imagine building something and living in the middle of the intersection of the highway overpass of the 174 on Montreal Road? You couldn't put a building there. Would you want to live right next door to that so that your backyard, you're facing out onto a highway? If anyone who's driven through, you know, along the 401 or the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto, that's a miserable place to try to live. There's no outdoor space, it's noise, it's constant, it's miserable, it's an awful place to live. So we have to think about where we're locating transit, and is it for the convenience of transit planning, or is it for the benefit of people? If that same phase 2 LRT instead was, say, an elevated SkyTrain type transit system that ran down Carling Avenue, down that huge grassy median of Carling Avenue, or were streetcars that picked up Vanier and Montfort Hospital and CMHC and the Wateridge Village redevelopment and those areas, you'd have a completely different conversation about the type of communities that we'd be building instead of running through miles of greenbelt.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, like it's got to benefit the community, and it's got to be strategic. So to be able to propose these high density locations, it would have to have some type of direct benefits to the area that it's surrounding, whether it's to the the retail community or any of the services for the city as well. So yeah,
Okay,
there's definitely had to be some thought into that for sure.
So thank you, Matt, for that. If you don't mind muting yourself one more time.
You bet.
Tone, it was a fabulous presentation, and we have it now recorded so others can listen. Eva comments, and she says, it seems to her that sorry guys, I got to mute some more people here. It seems to her that some people are locked into decisions that were made in the 70s and 80s, and they really haven't changed their view that cities are for cars, not for people, and it just doesn't seem logical. We have to go to Jonathan, and we have to get to Ralph. So this is the last question for you, Tone, and it has to be quick. It's from Peter. Which cities do you know adhere to your concept and your ideas for beautiful and sustainable places for people?
So at a much smaller scale, I would say something like Copenhagen, Antwerp, Florence. I mean, some of these are older cities, very old cities, some of them not so much.
Are there any in North America that you could point to?
Montreal is doing a very good job of this, certainly moving in the right direction. I would say something like, the core of Winnipeg, notwithstanding Portage and Main fiasco last year. But some of these individual cities are doing well. And don't get me wrong, I think Ottawa is doing a lot that's really good. But we're in this fight of the fact that we are amalgamated. We've got huge sprawl. We've got enormous footprint, and we're trying to meet the demands of very disparate communities from across a huge city, a huge geography that is really hard to reconcile. And I personally kind of wonder if it's even worth trying to reconcile and say, maybe instead I don't want to say the word de-amalgamate, but does it really make sense to try to have one city that covers the geography and one set of policies that covers the geography that we have today in this way?
That's a great point. Apparently, the physical geography of Ottawa is big enough to absorb Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, and we probably still have space left over. So it's a huge, huge area. Chris Canning adds that Madison, Wisconsin is also a great example of a city that exemplifies some of your ideas. All right, Jonathan, are you ready to go?
I'm good to go, yeah.
All right, so this is my handsome friend, Jonathan Westeinde, and welcome, Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll just do a brief intro of Windmill, and then a bit more of a narrative on thoughts on the official plan and some thoughts on that. Stone covered, you did a great job covering a lot of the bases, so we'll have more time for questions at the end. But Windmill's a firm we founded ourselves in 2003 with the goal to be sort of leaders in sustainability, urban infill sustainable development. So smart growth, if you want to call it. We are the only developer across North America where all our mixed-use projects have achieved LEED Platinum or better, and recently moved to what's called a One Planet Living framework. If you want to just flip the slide for a second. And so we really start, we only develop really where we think there's a political climate that is, sort of set up to work with us, to collaborate and to achieve, what should be, great outcomes for the development we're doing. And I would say in all those cases where we've had our biggest success is when we're doing those developments in some fashion, a partnership with the local municipality. Let's go to the next slide for a second. So this just sort of speaks to the spectrum of things that we've been involved with. We have we are primarily a developer. We also have a consulting arm called Urban Equation, which works with lots of municipalities and large developers and other levels of government in sustainability planning, and really more focused on showing the viability of it as opposed to just the conceptual element of it. Because from a development point of view, we obviously have to show that you can still make the same or more money, and that is the great thing about the built environment and sustainability is, if done properly, it is an accretive thing. It doesn't have to be a cost issue, but it also has to be something that is, I think, kind of driven on a common sort of goal, so that you're not sort of working in isolation. But I'll speak, just in highlighting some of these projects on this slide. I'll go from oldest to newest, but Dockside Green was a partnership we did with the City of Victoria, and it was probably the most progressive RFP I've still seen today, unfortunately, in sort of achieving a triple bottom line outcome. And this is one, and this is a sort of different ways of achieving outcomes from a planning policy or utilizing city lands, for example. But in this case, they really started with a fundamental metric of saying, if you'd like to bid on this property, the land is a fixed price, period. There's not going to be, there's only 10%, I think, of waiting for having greater land price than what the city wanted or not. The other 90% was all on a 300-point metrics, 100 points for, economy, environment, and social, and the different metrics around that, to show how, as a developer, you can achieve the greatest economic benefit for the city, but being calculated in all these key metrics of smart planning, which is, okay, what's going to reduce cars on the road, what's going to increase transit use, what's going to increase affordability, what's going to bring greater sustainability. So it's very, very smart crafted RFP. And with that, had the city really as our partner at the table when dealing with, say, it's environmental issues, things like that, where we had to go to provincial or other levels of government. And so it was a real collaborative effort to get through. And I think that is one thing when it comes to, say, the official plan and moving forward. It's ironic a bit in the sense that when you're working with the city, generally, we all are trying to achieve the same thing, but it's more a level of what degree of attention do you get, what degree of flexibility do you get, what degree of sort of planning support you get. So when we've been working with the city as a partner on these things, it's sort of like, who cares what the official plan says? Let's just all work towards the right outcomes and figure out how we can do it. As opposed to when you move to the other side of the spectrum and you're dealing just with a private piece of land, the planning process is one where the city just sort of abandons you, right? And so you go out there and kind of fight the fight with the neighborhood and see what can happen and see what you can achieve. When really it's sort of the collective requirement for this to really be a partnership and be a partnership to the community also in sort of demonstrating how we're going to achieve these outcomes. And I was part of a panel last week with Larry Beasley. Larry Beasley is touted to be given credit for the transformation of Vancouver, and now doing planning consulting around the world, and speaks to the fact that one of the biggest things that they learned as a city to sort of move their agenda forward is, yes, that they need to kind of see every development out there as something that the city is more partnering and supporting and outreach to the community and sort of helping define why the planning policies support what's happening, as opposed to a lot of public meetings today. The developers sort of, the city's there, but the developers sort of out front taking all the arrows, and the city's sort of reacts from that, and then politically sort of reacts from that, and then depending on how that all sort of filters out, that depends on, you know, whether that's going to go forward, irrespective of, you know, I shouldn't say irrespective completely, but often without sort of the goal vision items in mind to really achieve that. And so that would also, you know, some of these other developments we're highlighting here are all sort of more private oriented, and they were not able to get the same kind of traction and support, if you want to call it, at a political level, because the city was, even though it's the same goal to get the best sort of triple bottom line outcome for the city and its residents, and the outcome, it sort of gets treated differently, and you're stuck in the, you know, typical planning process. But that is you know, resource challenge, all those other things. The other one I'll just highlight that is more close to home in Ottawa is the Zibi project. And again, you know, there's one where we're dealing with a site that would have been seen, or many saw as one of the most complicated sites potentially in the city to get a rezoning done. And that was a factor of its you know, sitting on both sides of the river. So it's the city of Gatineau, it's the city of Ottawa, it's under the NCC's purview, which has a huge impact on a lot of the sort of, especially.
So, Jonathan?
Yeah.
Do you know what the NCC stands for?
Oh, there's many different iterations.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear yours.
I call it anyway, the No Commitment Club.
Right.
And the fact that you got Zibi approved without taking 20 years was a miracle. But how long did it take? But before you answer that question, Matt Slobodian in Winnipeg, can you hear okay? Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear Jonathan okay. All right, because Ken McKenzie's having a little trouble. So Ken, what you might do is you might log out and log back in and see if you can hear Jonathan. And Jonathan, it would really be nice if you turn on your camera so people can see you.
Oh, sure. Yep. Okay.
And there he is. So, Jonathan, how long did it take to get Zibi? Because you had not only Gatineau and Ottawa and the NCC, you had the federal government and two provincial governments.
Yeah. So I'll just complete that story here a second, because it was seen as one of the most complicated things to get through rezoning. You know, because it was basically a brownfield site. At the time we were looking at the site, you know, picture this, it's an island and waterfront right next to a river, and it was at the same time that downtown Calgary had flooded. So that was a huge issue as far as floodplain consideration. It has indigenous interests as a sort of a sacred place of worship from previous times. And so all these issues, transportation bottlenecks, all that kind of stuff, all these issues, you know, sort of led to a real hornet's nest of, okay, how do you work this through? And so we were able to start, and I think this is analogous to sort of how we need to be working at a high-level official plan level, with 8 guiding principles of what it is that we were trying to achieve with this site. And they were things such as carbon neutrality, such as many people working there as living there, meaning there has to be a certain amount of density, therefore, to kind of compensate both those things. Celebrating our waterfront. Ottawa is a city that it's a waterfront city with maybe 2 places you can actually have a beer on the water. So how do you activate and get your waterfront?
Absolutely.
Moving? So 8 guiding principles like that, which before we even drew a picture with you know, buildings that we went to, all those different levels, NCC, Gatineau, Ottawa, and had them essentially sign the 8 guiding principles and collapse their planning process such that we only had one, you know, effective design review panel amongst the 3 of them, with them all having representations on it, instead of having to have conflicting priorities and challenges with all 3. And again, it came down to sort of a discussion, because we did lots of things here where we're kind of breaking the rules. You know, we want to do European warn-offs like you'd see in Copenhagen, things like that. Well, you can't, you know, legally own the road as a private owner if you've got municipal infrastructure on it, you have parking on it, all these sorts of things that makes that impossible under our current planning sort of approach. And it was sort of one of these, okay, let's throw the policy out, let's agree these are the values and the principles we're trying to achieve, and let's just find ways to do that. And that's where we sort of got more creativity in the process. So to answer your question, Bruce, from, you know, we obviously did a lot of work in advance. We probably did, you know, call it 12 months of work in advance in sort of these discussions and moving things forward. But from the date we submitted our rezoning to approval, it was a 6-month process.
Wow. I mean, that is like a miracle. That's like the parting of the Red Seas
Yeah.
Right up there. But
Yeah.
what I was going to say, Jonathan, and I hear you loud and clear, that's great. But what I was going to say is that, many urban planners that I've talked to over the years really consider their zoning codes and their official plans as if they were like the 10 Commandments, and I say to them, I'll say to them, I'm not shy, I'll say, well, I wouldn't take, one of the 10 Commandments like thou shalt not kill and take out the word not. I wouldn't do that, maybe
Right.
You're changing, something that's really fundamental to our society. I agree with that. But official plans and zoning bylaws were written by human beings. We can change them.
Yeah, no, and that's my point. I think as we start getting into now discussion on the official plan and just sort of highlighting in our experience in the different developments we've had where we've been sitting at the table with the city as a partner. We're working with the city of Guelph right now for a major downtown intensification project there for a new municipal library, college, some 300 residential units. And again, there it's sort of all right, we have these planning policies, but we also want to achieve these objectives. So let's just work on how do we get to those objectives, and you're getting more creativity than, yes, the policies are Bible. And so how do you get that approach across the board is the challenge, because, if we're going to deal with that on another piece of dirt that isn't city owned, then no, we're stuck with, yes, the policies are the Bible. And so I think, the bold, sort of the 5 bold moves the city's trying to make are fantastic, but it does need to speak to the fact that, first of all, these things really need to be driven by, I think, certainly high level metrics and values that are trying to be achieved. And flexibility on how you get there. So for example, if one of the key goals is obviously greater urban intensification with affordability into it, what are the metrics to that? And then what are the different ways we can get there, as opposed to, okay, this piece of dirt, you can only do this no matter what, even though, there's creative ways on achieving some of those things. And it also does need to be bold, right? And to the point of what Toon made and others, we've declared a climate emergency as an example. What does that mean? How do you implement that? I don't think that's really, I think, again, it's been a statement, but how you filter that into your planning is a challenge. And I'll give an example. I sit on the ULI, North American Sustainability Council, and I was down in Washington 2 weeks ago for their fall conference. And one of the panels was the city of Washington and the city of New York, and one other who I can't remember, speaking about the planning policies they're putting in place as it relates to climate. New York City recently just passed what I would say is one of the strictest climate bills, and it basically mandated very clearly the requirement to be carbon neutral in all buildings by 2050 and needing to be, I think it's sort of 60% of the way there by 2030. And if not, there was a clearly defined fine process that would be put in place. And Heinz Development, for example, was up on stage griping a bit, saying, essentially that target today, if the fines are put in place, would cost them $30 million a year just on their New York portfolio. So quite strict. And it was a healthy debate between, sort of the developer and the city, but the city, the chief of staff from the mayor's office sort of said, at some point in time, we just have to recognize we just have to do this. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be something that, everyone's like, but we just have to do it. And by at least setting clear goals, a platform of, of an equal playing field, as much as Heinz was up there, sort of griping, they were also saying, we're just happy that at least it's everyone's got to play by these rules to get us to our targets, so we know what we're dealing with. And that is often a challenge we have in our planning policies as well, is that, the reason for the policies don't necessarily lead to the, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve. And if we don't know the outcome, and everyone is sort of having to play by rules to get to that outcome, it just creates, again, you're back to the lowest common denominator of getting to these things. But with that also, flexibility, to your point, Bruce, is increasingly, like, technology is, as we all know, it's moving at such a pace, and it's the point that was earlier made, the time frame it takes to get a planning application generally through and then under development is much slower than the pace of how fast technology is moving today.
Absolutely.
So unless we are, first of all, trying to, as part of this, figure out ways to expedite those processes, because as was earlier said, the cost of that is phenomenal and counter to economic development completely. But secondly, like if you take the car, for example, you know, we're planning a light rail system here that will not really be out to the full extent of phase 3 for another 10, maybe 15 years. At the same time, if you're sort of more on the aggressive side of things, then some would project that, you know, we're all going to be in automated cars in 10 years. And what does that do, you know, to
Right.
how we use transit or how we want to locate and all these kind of things. And you know, no one can answer that question today, but we do need to have a planning, an official plan that doesn't sort of set a mandate that can't be fixed for another 5 years until it's reviewed, but has a fluidity to it in sort of achieving the evolution of some of these technological advances. And part of that, which I've spoken to the city, you know, anytime I'm talking about these things is you know, effectively you need kind of an R&D process. You know, if you're in any evolved organization where you're planning for the future, you always have a bit of an R&D department. And the idea of sort of having a pilot program within an official plan policy is sort of, you know, foreign, but I don't know how else you can kind of keep things fluid and moving unless you're sort of also willing to say, okay, here's something that right now, whatever it happens to be, goes completely against all our current planning policies, but let's do an isolated pilot, see how it works. And if it works in one instance, then we can start seeing how we integrate it and move it along. So we're keeping our plans current all the time, as opposed to, you know, just broad.
I think you told me some time ago that when you put your developer hat on, that you know, when you developed a project, when Windmill developed a project that was within shouting distance of transit and was a very walkable neighborhood, the sell-through was quite quick. And when you developed projects where it was a community that was less walkable, it took much longer to make that project successful. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, I mean, whether it's us, or, I mean, you can see it even right now along, we were in an architect's office the other day, and they had plotted out, you know, sort of all the applications for new high-rise development in Ottawa, and guess what? You know, it's no surprise to everybody, but it's you know, 90% along the LRT. And you know, rationale for that obviously is, yes, the ability to access quickly transit and find mobility. And I would say, you know, where we haven't found situations where we've been right on rapid transit, where we have been able to provide options, so car share programs, bike share programs, things like that, all those things sort of increase, because, you know, I think fundamentally, especially as you get more and more into the urban environment, people don't want to be in their car as long as you can give them an option not to be. And if there's not a good option, they'll be in their car, and then that creates a whole spiral effect. But it is, you know, I'm in my Toronto office right now, but it is, you know, it is amazing if you sit up at the end of Yonge and Eglinton and you look down, you know, even pronounced such that along Yonge Street, it's just, you know, every node where there's a subway stop, you see, you know, high intensity, and then it levels back off until the next subway stop, you know, so it's a notional trend. But there is also, again, this idea that rapid transit today is the solution, but tomorrow, you know, once with the electrification of vehicles or other things, you know, I ride an electric bike, and you see guys ride around all sorts of different electrical devices. You know, some of that needs to be considered in the sense, okay, how much does that being right next to transit is important if there's other alternatives coming up the pipe that give mobility flexibility as well. You know, and I would say the other thing is that, you know, for the city of Ottawa really to step back and make these bold moves, it does really take some questioning of some major things, you know, and some of these things, unfortunately, in Ottawa are not totally in the city's control, and that's one of the conflicts this city has with the NCC in places. It's a lot of its suburban, urban are dictated by moves the NCC has made. But there is, and Tone, you brought it up, but, you know, I'm a big believer if the smartest growth right now would be to fill it in the green belt and create a new belt, and make it a real one, because it is just costing more, you know, it's just creating a greater expense, greater commute, more traffic, all those sorts of things by maintaining it in place. But there's lots of pros and cons, but there's, you know, things like that I think need to be really looked at from, if we really want to get to carbon neutral, all these are all big moves that would make a big difference, but politically are going to be, you know, a real football.
And I agree with you. I just want to interject there. I think that rather than, you could even go a step beyond that, and instead of filling in the greenbelt, which is incredible natural resources and experimental farms and lands, if we did something really bold that no one has ever thought of, but if we did something like put in congestion pricing, if you had a congestion price and a parking levy downtown, we would have paid for all of our LRT without needing the massive tax increases and fare increases. You could have free transit suddenly, and if we didn't widen highways, you had a congestion pricing, you had extra costs to park your car downtown, you'd suddenly be having a completely different conversation about the kind of transit we need to build. And we'd be building faster transit, more BRT, more quickly, and it'd be more collaborative. And we'd get to zero carbon neutral or net zero energy a hell of a lot faster. Because instead of living in beyond the green belt, you could be living in town in moderate and mid-rise buildings. Mid-rise is faster to market than high-rise. Planning policies and development charges are stacked against mid-rise development, and it makes it more difficult. We could build the mass timber missing middle that we need that is ultra low energy and achieve the built environment we want if we saw the process differently.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. To me, it makes no sense for us to sort of fiddle around on the edges. We pick up the little crumbs. Part of the reason I wanted to organize this is to get some bold ideas on the table and to kind of break what Eva was saying earlier on chat, to break the mold, and to change our policies. James Howard Kunstler, who's a noted urbanist, even though he's a journalist, he's written many books, Home from Nowhere and others, that are really actually pretty good. And I'm not saying that I totally agree with him, but he says, burn all your zoning codes if you want to make a better city.
Yeah.
All right. So, Jonathan, I had one more question that I wanted to challenge you on. And then we have one from Ishan as well. But I have a question for you. You told me something about how you were financing some extra green technology investment in one of your buildings. I think it's the one where you have the theater company in it. And as you were building it, you put more money into it over and above what would normally be a budget. So you blew your own budget, but you found a very innovative way, I think with a French company, to finance some green improvements. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then we're going to go to Ralph Shaw.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, that is fundamental to some of this stuff. I mean, that wasn't sort of a surprise to us. We'd kind of planned, and that's where sort of a lot of the innovation we've worked on is more the financial side of how you achieve this stuff, because there is, good buildings do cost more. Highly sustainable buildings that are going to be carbon neutral, they cost more, but it's a case of how do you define cost more. So today, our whole financial structure, our appraisal structure, all that kind of stuff, it really is focused on first cost, not life cycle cost. And so we've always focused on what's the best life cycle cost, meaning, yes, we don't mind spending more upfront if we know that for the long term, operating cost, energy costs, durability, all those sorts of things are going to, over time make that. However, in the marketplace today, there's very little opportunity for how you finance that delta, because we still as a developer are looking to get our first costs out and pass on the difference to say, and this in that case was a condo. We've always worked on the premise that although people would like a highly more sustainable, energy efficient, they're not going to pay more for it. So how do we bridge that divide? So we've been using a vehicle called the Green Loan, and really what the Green Loan is essentially, say in the situation of a condo, buyer pays the same condo across the street. The condominium maintenance fees are the same as the guy across the street. The only thing is that because we've embedded in our design, design measures and mechanical systems that actually save money, we're able to put a loan that's amortized through those savings into their common element at the same price that is essentially paying back for those costs. And then usually we're doing a 7-year amortization. After the 7th year, then the condominium owner is actually seeing the ability for the condominium fees to drop on that front, as opposed to sort of constant escalation. It might not have been the clearest sort of explanation, but fundamentally,
that was an excellent explanation, and I had forgotten the last bit. So I knew that for extra investment in green technology and green whatever elements to the building, there's an extra cost. that was paid for the condo fees. But because the condo fees for operating the condo were lower, that lower cost pays for the green technology. That is absolutely brilliant. And it does tell something. It's really important for everybody on this call and everybody who will watch this replay. What's really important, what Jonathan taught me, is that I agree with this. I don't think there is actually a choice here where, oh, we can be economically successful or we can be environmentally successful. I actually think those two things are linked, especially when you do clever, interesting things like this green financing. I think you called it a green loan.
It's called the green loan, and at the time we couldn't find anyone, because the developer, we still didn't want to be carrying that loan for the next 7-10 years. So we found a bank out of France who ended up buying our green loans office, and they did well off it. And then since then we created a pilot with the Toronto Atmospheric Fund here in Toronto. And they now run that as a standard program for developers here in Toronto. And then we just completed a project in Ottawa called Cathedral Hill. And so they own the green loan. The Toronto Atmospheric Fund owns a green loan. Ottawa doesn't have an equivalent.
I'm going to have to write it down because I'll probably, another year go by, I'll forget about it. So we have one more question for you, Jonathan, from Ishan. He's a very young a member of this meetup today. And then we'll come to you, Ralph. And Ishan is asking you, Jonathan, what's your opinion on passive housing, specifically in multifamily buildings? Can we design, the missing middle buildings with, as passive houses? And can you actually make those work from an economic point of view?
So the answer is yes and no. I mean, it depends on, so say, for example, a climate like Vancouver is a lot easier to work through a passive house type situation than a climate like Ottawa, where we have such extremes. But I would say that, and it's also, again, that, a passive house is really needed when you don't have a clean grid. If you have a clean, if you're just looking at electricity use, for example, or clean energy use. So there's a hybrid of things here that can get us to the outcome. A passive house is one of the more challenging approaches as you get into multi-res and high-rise, and there are lots of people focusing and trying to do it right now, which is great. But I'd say the biggest challenge there, again, becomes one of more on the finance side of I think passive house, if done properly, can have that positive life cycle cost, but it's that much more an exaggeration of higher front end cost to life cycle savings at the end, and how do you bridge the gap and all those sorts of things. So fundamentally, I'm a fan. I support it. I think there's again, it really is a case of, again, back to how much time, which is always the challenge when you have a lot of friction just to get approvals through. Then lots of people often just drop the intent of all the time it takes to say work on actually achieving passive house, because it's just such turmoil to just even get the approvals. If you can have the city sort of working collaboratively to reward that, such that it can knock down some time that you need to be otherwise spending here and spend it there, then I think you get more attention to it. So it speaks to, again, this need to sort of really collaborate to achieve some of these outcomes.
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for making so much of your time available to me, to this group, and I really appreciate all the things I've learned from you, and I continue to learn from you. Ralph, are you there? You have to unmute yourself, Ralph.
I am Ralph Shaw.
Okay, there we are. Here's my friend Ralph Shaw, broker of record and former president of the Ottawa Real Estate Board. And I do have one of your slides here, and Ralph, over to you.
All right, well, I'm not near as well organized as you know, Bruce. Like the ADD kicks in with me. So my basic, I guess, thoughts on the topic is the contradiction between the plan versus the outcome. As you know, the urban boundary was established, in my opinion, initially to try to concentrate services and development in an orderly fashion to make better utilization of transportation and utilities and whatever. And really, it was the transition between with the amalgamation of the city of Ottawa. In my opinion, the Watson administration decided to use it for a different purpose, and that was to justify the light rail by trying to build concentrations of high density occupancy along the train route. And maybe an honorable thing, but the reality is not everybody wants to live in a high-rise condo environment. So even where they take these 8-story buildings and jack them to 27, we've seen a real pause, if you will, because of just oversupply, which is finally being eaten up in the last 12 months, 18 months. But we've had a lot of mothballed condo development programs because there just hasn't been the demand for that particular product I think the administration thought, oh, well, if we build it, they will come. What it's done is it's pushed people outside of Ottawa. And it doesn't matter whether it's Castleman or Kempful or Carleton Place. The reality of the situation is that in that 20 to 30 minute commute, people can move out. So this is where I talk about the contradiction.
Yeah. Ralph, I'm going to add something there. I checked the stats for Ontario between 2006 and 2011. That's the census stats. And the fastest growing city in Ontario wasn't, Mississauga or Burlington or Toronto. It was Arnprior.
Exactly. And well, I'll give you an example. And I'm going to pick on Carleton Place, and that's what you see in front of you. And I'm going to digress.
This is in Carleton Place?
Yeah.
Okay.
And go back to it because Carleton Place and Castleman are the same kind of commute time, one east, one west. And I'll talk about east-west economy or the differences between the two. But realistically, what we've got is that the lifestyles, the schools, these smaller communities offer, a lot more than just affordable housing, but basically for the millennials or whatever that have young families. And the reason I picked on Carleton Place is the West End is growing a lot quicker than the East right now. And that's because of the Department of Defense moving into the Nortel campus and the technology sector in Canada. And I don't think a lot of people outside of Ottawa or even in Ottawa appreciate. It's $1 billion of GDP to our economy. There's 3,000 unfilled positions posted right within the high-tech market there now. So and it's all about employment. People are going to live where they work, and therefore the drive out of Carleton Place or Elmont or Arnprior is really, really convenient. And they're in the Upper Canada School Board, which has a lower student ratio to teachers. They have, like Carleton Place has 3 ice surfaces and an indoor soccer field. And people think, well, that's for the kids. It's not. The military, a major's only about 38 years old. It's mom and dad that want to play hockey, and they don't want to play at 2 o'clock in the morning. So it's all about the combination of things that these older, smaller communities are offering, not just affordability. I was at a Canadian Real Estate Association meeting over the weekend, and one of the things that came out was that Toronto now has $186,000 of development and permit fees on a residential lot. Like, holy smokes! Like when you have to eat $186,000 in soft cost, how does a guy like Jonathan go out and build something? It almost makes it prohibitive before you put the first hole in the ground. All right, so going back, what's in front of you? And this is my frustration. Like Mr. Dreessen may be an exception, but I can tell you the planners aren't as progressive as the architects, I guess, because my experience with planners is that they were educated collectively in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they just keep regurgitating what they learned in school rather than looking forward. And this was a development of one of my clients, Volunderthorpe Jordson, an Icelandic guy that immigrated to Canada, put forward to Carleton Place in about 2011, 2012. And it was a mixed use on 35 acres of land that the town ended up owning as part of its infrastructure development. And like on the one drawing, flip to the other one, Bruce, just quickly, and then we'll come back to this one.
There's
Did
another one?
Did I give you a second one? Nah, don't worry about it. I'll tell you about it. Anyway, there was a Prost Hospital campus on it. There was already a fitness center. So the whole idea was to put this traditional, what I call mixed use employment, residential collection together with a little bit of retail. And what he had, so Wally was going to do 33-story towns, as you can see, 38 loft apartments. There was an 8-story retirement building, which in essence was really interesting, got built just down the street on another piece of ground, okay? 15,000 square feet of medical offices. That was probably very realistic because they had set aside land for a new hospital. So the idea was to make it a health campus. Then there was 50,000 square feet of employment and professional offices. The 16,000 square foot retail, that was Shoppers Drug Mart. And they had 70,000 square feet of underground parking. So on 30-acre site, you can see we had really good densities and this mixed use. Wally had built a model of it. The town was all excited. Our elected officials, the local planner reluctantly, because council was so in favor of it, was all gung-ho. And then McIntosh Perry, a local consulting and company with a planning division, who was the consultant for the town of Carleton Place, stepped in and said, "My goodness, you can't do this. You can't mix employment lands and with residential. You've got to segregate them and whatever." And all of a sudden, the elected people ran for the hills. They all pretended they didn't know each other, let alone the developer, and the whole thing just blew up. And to me. So then what did we do? Well, what Carleton Place and MTO and the province of Ontario did is they built a 4-lane highway from Carleton Place into Canada. That's really efficient, right? So what you do is you get all the people coming out because of affordability to live in Carleton Place and drive their vehicle back and forth to those 3,000 unfilled positions in Canada, say a 30-minute commute, which is so contradictory, in my opinion, what it should be. I mean, these people would have been walking to work. Right? We had other land that could have, hosted other, say, small technology companies or whatever, and it was all done because we have the bureaucrats wagging the dog. Our elected officials.
What happened to this property?
Pardon?
What happened to this property?
Blew up. Oh, you'll love this, Bruce. Basically, what we've got there is they chopped it up into these 1 and 2 acre sites, and I just did some quick math on it. Is right now, the coverage of the buildings versus land is about 8%.
Wow.
So on an acre lot, 43,560 feet of land, we're getting these 3,000 square foot. Like we've got a surveyor office, we've got a small repair garage, we have a daycare center. But again, the land use, and again, municipalities, and I rant at this with my council all the time, where they can't seem to figure out that assessment is the only business, the financial business that they're in. And when they get these low density, developments, the whole community suffers. The land use suffers.
So we are all hearing, we heard from Toon, we heard from Jonathan, heard something from me, and now from you, Ralph. So I have a question for you, Ralph. Let's get over the frustration with the tail wagging the dog. Let's get over the frustration with urban planners who are maybe, just following a zoning code without, really much thought to it or behind it. How do we go about changing this? How do we go about getting urban planners to work with architects and developers and community associations and business improvement associations and others so that we can actually build, mixed use communities that people actually want to live in? How do we do that, Ralph? And I'm going to throw that out to you, Toon, and also to Jonathan, but first Ralph, and then Toon, and then Jonathan.
I guess the first thing, because of Jonathan's success, I think I'd hire him. I don't know how he got that through in the time that he got it through.
We hired Jonathan. Toon, what's your comment?
So I would say that you could, first of all, you need to hire more architects, get more architects involved in infrastructure, bridges, city planning, urban design. You need more architects. Yep. And at the same time, you could have the number of planning staff and vastly improve planning processes. And do it all through the lens of a national policy that looks at the primary objective, which is social goals and social aspirations and the social mobility and strength that we need in our communities.
Yeah, just to build on what Toon just said, for some reason, I don't really know why, the city of Ottawa, which is smaller than Calgary and not growing quite as quickly as Calgary, we have 16,500 FTEs, full-time equivalents, what you and I would know as jobs. We have 16,500 people working in the city of Ottawa. Calgary, which as I said is a bit bigger and growing faster, somehow makes do with 9,500. And the difference is 7,000 workers in City Hall. I'm not exactly clear what they do. I'm sure they're busy, but still. And that represents, at least a $700 million, if not an $800 or $900 million additional annual expense for taxpayers. And something I didn't realize until a few years ago is that the city of Ottawa's property taxes are higher than Toronto, which is a much bigger city. And I would have thought that was impossible. But anyway, that's me belly aching. Jonathan, what's your take on how we could, you got Zibby approved in 6 months. To me, that's a miracle. How do we, you talked about expanding that across the platform. How do you do that?
Well, I agree with exactly what Toon said, which is essentially like the less time you can be spending fighting with city staff over policy of the depth of a tree well and all these sorts of things, which, and the more, you know, like you're never having that discussion, you know, going through the approvals process on okay, how do we get to affordable housing, all these sorts of things. And so, you know, when we're working with a project like Zibi, again, as I said, it really was a partnership where we had the senior attention of those different municipalities focused on the end game of what we're trying to achieve and working with us to do that. In a typical application process, it is more about just, you know, having to waste so much time and effort just to get an approval. There's no time left, unfortunately, for people to want to spend energy and money on sort of saying, okay, and how do we build on this to make it better, right? And so, Tom, your comment's great in the sense of like cut the staff in half, have clear objectives and social policies we're trying to achieve, and make that all part of the discussion, because it's not today.
Yeah, I hear you, and the fact that developers get worn out, you know, and proponents get worn out, and architects get worn out in the process. So one of the things that helped me a lot in my career when I was trying to get approvals for the Palladium, which is where the Ottawa Senators play, it's now called Canadian Tire Centre, the province of Ontario appointed a facilitator. So Jonathan, I you know, and Ralph and Tone, what I hope that might find its way into the new official plan for the City of Ottawa, which is due out in 2021, would be you know, the opportunity for, certainly on major community facilities, but even maybe, you know, lower down in terms of project size, is having a facilitator who actually has real power to call to the carpet, basically, people who are delaying projects really unnecessarily. And I'm going to give you a very, very simple example. Dave Bush, are you still on the call here? If you are, can you unmute yourself? Because I'm going to talk about you. I'm going to just.
Yeah, I'm here, Bruce.
Hi, David.
Hi.
Thanks for joining the call today. So, Dave, you remember when you had? I'll just set the scene, and we're almost done here, guys. We'll be done in 2 or 3 minutes. But I'll tell you a little story about Dave and Angela Bush. Dave and Angela Bush. I started coaching them a few years ago, and they own a beautiful little triplex in Little Italy. And on the ground floor, there's a 2-bedroom apartment, and it has one door to the street and one door to the side. And Angela and Dave wanted to create 2 affordable apartments out of one. So they needed to put up a wall, and one wall, and add a little kitchen and a WC, a water closet, a bathroom on one side. And then they would have, with these 2 existing doors, they would have 2 one-bedroom apartments to rent, which would be good for them, but also good for creating another unit. And we went to see, Dave and I went to see the City of Ottawa young planner, and she was very nice. And she started reading off all the list of studies that Dave would have to do. And Dave and his dad could put up one wall to create another unit and put in this small kitchen and WC for $15,000. And Dave, do you remember what the total cost for all those studies were?
Yeah, I think it was somewhere in around 35,000.
Yeah, so Dave would have to spend at least a year, maybe more, doing a bunch of studies. And one of the studies I remember was a streetscape heritage plan. And that was one I hadn't heard of before. I'm sure Tone would know it, but I hadn't heard of it before, because there's a streetscape overlay for Little Italy, which is great. But I said, well, wait a second, ma'am. There's 2 existing doors, you know, they're not like this. They're one's 90 degrees to the other, sort of like that. And I said, there's actually no change at all to the streetscape, at all, like no changes at all. And why would Dave and Angela have to do a $5,000 or $6,000 streetscape heritage analysis overlay study, you know, when there's no changes to the outside of the building? Well, she said it's still a requirement. So it's that kind of thing. You know, when you start from something, you know, and by the way, the project never went ahead. I mean, nobody's going to spend $35,000 in 1 or 2 years of planning to do a $15,000 renovation. So I felt bad about it. But we have to, like Jonathan has said that, and I think Tone was going there, and certainly Ralph has expressed his frustration. I think we have to find ways to get around that. And I do have a solution that I'm hoping to put into the new official plan. One of them I mentioned already is appointment of a facilitator to help people, whether it's Dave and Angela doing something, you know, fairly small, or it's Tone and Ralph and Jonathan doing much bigger projects. The other thing I would like to see is something that I learned from the city of Nepean. You know, it's got to be 25 years ago. When the planning department in the city of Nepean, we don't have a city of Nepean anymore, it got amalgamated away. But when we did, Bill Leatham was the head of planning there. And what Bill would do when whether it was Dave and Angela just trying to create another unit, or it's, you know, Tone doing a big infill project, or Ralph doing a big infill project, or Jonathan, what Bill would do is he would call in his transportation people, his traffic people, his planning people, his servicing people, and he would say, look, we're not going to ask Mr. and Mrs. Bush to spend $35,000. We're actually, the city of Nepean is going to do the work so we can get this desirable outcome. And I would really like to see a process where if there's a benefit to the community, that there's a different process that we could go through that's much less bureaucratic. And maybe, as Jonathan was saying, we could extend that much, much further. So anyway, that brings us to 1:30. I will put this, I'm going to stop sharing now. I will put this on YouTube. Everybody will get a link. There'll be lots of people who will look at it on replay. And again, I can't thank Ralph, you, and Tone, and Jonathan enough, and everybody else for participating today. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.